The snow came down in thick, heavy sheets, swallowing the streets of Aspen Creek whole. Headlights barely cut through the swirling white, and the wind howled with a voice that belonged more to wolves than to weather. On a night like this, most folks huddled by fireplaces, wrapped in blankets, praying the power lines didn't go down. But out on County Road 17, Officer Jack Callahan knew warmth wasn't in the cards. He and his K-9 partner Apollo had learned long ago that trouble doesn't check the weather before it shows up. It was just after 11 p.m. when Apollo stiffened in the backseat of the cruiser. The German shepherd's ears shot up, his nose pressed hard against the window, and a sharp bark tore through the car. Jack slowed, every muscle in his body tightening. Apollo wasn't the type to bark at shadows. Something was wrong. Jack killed the siren, pulling the cruiser onto the shoulder where the woods pressed close. The snow had already covered the ground in a pale, suffocating blanket. Apollo whined once, then barked again, louder this time, pawing at the door. "All right, boy," Jack muttered, tugging his flashlight from the dash. "Show me what you got." The second his boots hit the snow, the storm bit down on him, icy flakes clawing at his face. He let Apollo lead, the leash taut as the dog surged forward into the trees. Jack's light swept across branches heavy with snow, the beam catching on shadows that looked too much like figures. And then he heard it, faint, nearly buried beneath the wind. A muffled cry. Human. Jack's pulse spiked. He pushed harder through the drifts, following Apollo as the dog pulled toward the sound with desperate urgency. The flashlight beam bounced off the ancient oak that loomed in the clearing like a skeletal giant. And there, tied at its base, was a shape that stopped Jack cold. A girl. She was slumped against the trunk, her arms wrenched behind her back, rope biting into her wrists. A gag cut across her mouth, her face streaked with frozen tears. Snow had gathered in her hair, a tangled curtain of chestnut that stuck to her pale cheeks. Her eyes, wide and glassy with terror, locked on Jack's beam of light. "God almighty," Jack whispered, racing forward. Apollo was already there, circling her, barking furiously as if daring the storm to come closer. The dog pressed his nose against her knee, whining as if assuring her she wasn't alone anymore. Jack dropped to his knees, slicing through the ropes with his knife. "You're safe," he said firmly, his voice steady even as adrenaline roared in his ears. "You're safe now. I've got you." The girl's body crumpled into his arms the moment the last rope snapped free. She was shivering violently, lips blue from the cold. He yanked off his heavy jacket, wrapping it around her frail frame. Apollo pressed closer, his body heat a living shield against the brutal wind. "Stay with me," Jack urged. "We're getting you out of here." Her lips trembled, words barely audible. "He said he'd come back." Jack froze, his stomach lurching. He scanned the tree line, his flashlight slicing into the shadows. Empty, silent, just the hiss of the storm. But her words lodged like glass in his chest. He'd come back. Whoever tied her here wasn't finished. Apollo growled low, ears pivoting, nose testing the air. Jack trusted his partner more than he trusted half the deputies in the county. If Apollo thought danger was still close, then it probably was. With one arm cradling the girl, Jack rose, trudging back toward the cruiser. Apollo trotted at his side, glancing over his shoulder, never letting the woods out of his sight. Jack lowered her gently into the back seat, tucking his jacket tighter around her. Apollo climbed in beside her, pressing his weight against her shivering legs. The girl's hand trembled as it reached out, gripping the dog's fur like an anchor. Apollo stayed perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on hers, letting her know she wasn't alone. Jack floored it toward the hospital, lights flashing against the snow, siren wailing through the night. But his mind wasn't just on the girl. It was on the monster who had left her to die. The emergency room doors burst open as Jack carried her inside. Nurses rushed forward, peeling back blankets, checking her vitals, calling for warm fluids. A doctor appeared, his face lined with the kind of fatigue that only came from decades of midnight calls. He nodded at Jack. "We've got her. You did good." But Jack shook his head. "She's alive, yeah. But whoever put her there, he's still out there." Apollo stood at Jack's side, chest heaving, eyes never leaving the girl. The shepherd whined once, low, almost like he was saying what Jack already knew. This wasn't over. For most people, stories like this end at the hospital doors. But in Aspen Creek, nothing stayed buried for long. and Jack had a feeling Apollo was about to uncover more than anyone was ready for. Sometimes the only way to get through a story like this is to remember you're not in it alone. If you're drawn into these journeys of survival and justice, make sure you stick around, because every new discovery, every secret pulled from the shadows, matters more than you think. Jack leaned against the cold tile wall, watching through the glass as nurses worked over the girl. Her name, he learned, was Rachel Morgan, 19, a freshman at the community college 2 towns over. She'd been missing for 3 days. Her family had plastered her picture across gas stations and grocery store bulletin boards. And now she was here, barely clinging to life, muttering about a man who promised to come back. Jack clenched his fists, forcing down the anger. 3 days missing, tied up in the snow like a discarded doll. That meant the man had kept her alive for reasons Jack didn't want to think about. Apollo nudged his leg, breaking the storm in his head. Jack dropped a hand to the dog's head. "We're gonna find him, buddy," he murmured. "Whatever it takes." The next morning, snow still smothered the town, but Jack and Apollo were already back at the oak tree. Crime scene tape fluttered weakly in the wind. Deputies scoured the ground, snapping photos, bagging evidence. Jack crouched low, studying the rope fibers he'd cut. Apollo sniffed the base of the tree, ears pricked, tail rigid. Then he pulled, nose dragging him toward the edge of the clearing. Jack followed, boots crunching over the frozen crust. They reached the tracks. Faint, nearly buried by the storm, but still visible. Tires, not from a car, too wide. A truck. Jack's pulse ticked faster. Apollo's bark shattered the silence, sharp and commanding. The shepherd pawed at the snow, uncovering scraps of duct tape, one edge stained faintly with blood. Jack bagged it carefully, jaw tightening. This wasn't just cruelty, it was planned, calculated, and Rachel's whispered warning echoed in his mind like a gunshot. He said he'd come back. The case wasn't just starting, it was unraveling. And if Jack had learned anything in his 15 years wearing the badge, it was this. When Apollo barked at ghosts in the snow, they were never ghosts at all. The morning after Rachel Morgan was rescued, Aspen Creek didn't wake up quietly. A town of less than 5,000, nestled between mountain ridges and pine forests, was used to gossip spreading quicker than wildfire. And this time, the gossip wasn't about property disputes or high school football. It was about the 19-year-old girl who had been found tied to an oak tree in the middle of a snowstorm, and about the police officer in his K9 who had pulled her back from the brink of death. Jack Callahan had been in law enforcement long enough to know how rumors could twist facts. But one thing was certain, this was no accident, no misunderstanding. Someone in his town had meant for Rachel to die out there. And until they were behind bars, Aspen Creek wasn't safe. The hospital cafeteria smelled faintly of burned coffee and scrambled eggs. Jack sat at a corner table, his uniform still dusted with dried snow. Apollo stretched out beneath his boots. The German shepherd's tail thumped once when Jack slid him a piece of toast, but otherwise he stayed still, eyes fixed on the door. Jack sipped his coffee and scanned the notes he had scribbled overnight. Rachel's condition was stable, but she hadn't said much since whispering those haunting words. He said he'd come back. The doctors were careful, saying she was suffering from exposure and trauma. But Jack needed more. He needed a lead, something concrete to chase. The door swung open, and Sheriff Helen Rhodes walked in. She was in her mid-50s with short silver hair and a voice that could quiet a barroom brawl. Helen had been sheriff of Aspen Creek for almost 20 years, and though she trusted Jack, she also knew when to press him hard. "Callahan," she said, sliding into the chair across from him, "tell me everything again." Jack laid it out. The call from dispatch, Apollo's reaction, the muffled cry, the oak tree, the ropes, the duct tape, Rachel's words. Helen listened, arms folded, her sharp blue eyes narrowing as he spoke. "And you're sure about the tracks?" she asked finally. "Truck tires," Jack replied. "Wide ones. Heavy treads. Could have been buried by now, but Apollo caught the scent. He's the only reason I saw them before the snow covered everything." Helen sighed, rubbing her temples. "Damn storm. Makes evidence vanish quicker than a thief in Denver." Apollo lifted his head at her voice, ears pricking. Helen reached down, scratching him behind the ear. "Good boy," she murmured. "We'd be blind without you." Jack folded his notes. "We need to talk to Rachel again. Even small details could matter." By mid-afternoon, Rachel was awake, pale against the hospital sheets but more alert than she had been the night before. Her mother sat by her side, clutching her hand, while Jack and Helen stood near the doorway, with Apollo lying quietly at their feet. Rachel's voice was hoarse, but she tried. I don't remember everything. He kept a bag over my head most of the time. I only heard things. What things? Jack asked gently. Rachel's eyes flicked toward Apollo. The shepherd wagged his tail once, as if encouraging her. He smelled like gasoline, she whispered, and he hummed. Country songs, old ones. My granddad used to listen to them. She paused, shuddering. And he said I wasn't the first. The room went cold. Helen's jaw tightened, and Jack felt the weight of her words land heavy in his chest. You're safe now, Jack assured her, but we're going to find him. I promise you that. Rachel's eyes filled with tears, but she managed a small nod. Please, don't let him hurt anyone else. Back at the oak tree, deputies were combing the area again, though most of the storm had wiped it clean. Apollo was restless, nose pressed to the snow, circling and circling until suddenly he barked sharply. Jack hurried over, crouching where the dog had dug his paw into the frozen ground. There, buried beneath a thin crust of ice, was a scrap of fabric, dark blue torn at the edges. Jack slipped it into an evidence bag, studying it under the fading light. A jacket sleeve? Work clothes? Apollo wasn't done. He pulled Jack toward the edge of the clearing, where the woods thinned near a narrow service road. The faint impression of tire tracks, long since half buried by drifting snow, lined the shoulder. Jack crouched, his flashlight beam catching a glimmer of something metallic. He picked it up carefully, a rusted keychain, shaped like a guitar pick, etched with the name Barrett. Jack's stomach dropped. Everyone in town knew Tommy Barrett. Tommy Barrett was 37, with hollow cheeks and a temper that earned him more enemies than friends. He'd worked at the old lumber mill before it shut down, and ever since, he'd been a regular at Murphy's Tap Room, where fights broke out as often as beers were poured. Folks whispered about his drinking, about his anger, about the way he looked at women a little too long, but no one had ever pinned something like this on him. Until now. Jack bagged the keychain, glancing at Apollo. Good work, partner. The shepherd wagged his tail but kept his eyes locked on the road ahead, as if daring Barrett himself to appear out of the snow. That night, Aspen Creek felt different. The streets were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that came with snow. It was the quiet of fear, of doors locked early, of blinds drawn tight. Parents kept their kids inside, and whispers spread through the diner and the grocery store. Rachel Morgan was found, tied to a tree. Someone in this town did it. Jack sat at his kitchen table. Apollo curled on the rug, his eyes half shut but ears still alert. Jack's brother's old photo hung on the wall. Michael, forever 23, lost to a car accident on a road much like County 17. Jack had promised himself years ago that he'd never let another family endure a loss like that if he could help it. He leaned down, scratching Apollo's ears. We're not stopping until we've got him, you hear? Apollo's eyes opened, dark and steady. The shepherd gave a single wag of his tail, as if to say, I'm with you. The next morning, Helen called. Deputies had visited Barrett's trailer on the outskirts of town. Empty, cold, snow piled on the steps, but tire tracks, fresh this time, led away from the property. Jack and Apollo were on the road within minutes. They followed the tracks toward the old hunting cabins that dotted the forest, remnants of a time when Aspen Creek had been more logging camp than town. Apollo jumped from the cruiser the moment they arrived, nose to the ground. He pulled hard toward one of the cabins, its windows boarded, the lock hanging crooked on the door. Jack drew his weapon, nodding to the deputies behind him. Apollo barked once, sharp and commanding. Jack kicked the door in. The air inside was sour, gasoline, mildew, and something darker. The flashlight beam swept across the room, a stained mattress in the corner, empty beer bottles, duct tape, and on the floor a scarf crusted with dried blood. Jack's stomach clenched. This wasn't just a hideout. This was where Rachel had been kept, and maybe where others had been too. Apollo growled low, his body stiff, eyes locked on the shadows at the back of the cabin. Jack's finger tightened on the trigger, but the room was empty. Whoever had been here was long gone. Still, one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Barrett wasn't just running. He was planning. And Rachel's whispered words came back like a ghost in the wind. He said he'd come back. Outside, the snow had stopped, But the silence of the woods pressed in heavy and cold. Jack crouched beside Apollo, the evidence bag with the bloody scarf in his hand. "This is bigger than we thought, partner," he muttered. "He's not done. Not by a long shot." Apollo pressed his nose into the ground again, whining softly before lifting his head and staring into the endless line of trees. His breath steamed in the cold, his eyes sharp, waiting. Somewhere out there, Barrett, or whoever else was involved, was still watching, still waiting. And Jack knew this was only the beginning of a hunt that would test both man and dog to their breaking point. Snow crunched under Jack Callahan's boots as he stepped out of the hunting cabin. The air was so still it seemed to press against his chest. Behind him, deputies moved quietly, photographing the stained mattress, the duct tape, the bloody scarf. But none of that noise mattered compared to the low growl vibrating in Apollo's throat. The German shepherd stood at the threshold, hackles raised, nose twitching. His body was rigid, alert, his gaze fixed on the tree line. Jack didn't have to wonder what Apollo sensed. He knew. Someone had been here recently, maybe still close. Jack crouched, resting a hand on the dog's strong neck. "Easy, boy. We'll find him." Apollo's growl faded into a whine, then he tugged at the leash, pulling Jack toward the woods behind the cabin. Jack followed, his flashlight beam bouncing off branches heavy with snow. Deputies called after him, but he waved them off. When Apollo was working, nothing mattered more than his nose. The trail wound deeper into the forest, away from the dirt road and into silence. Every so often, Apollo stopped, pawed at the ground, then surged forward again. Jack scanned the snow carefully, looking for signs. A boot print here, a snapped twig there. Whoever had fled the cabin hadn't been careful enough. 10 minutes in, Apollo halted near a shallow creek frozen over with ice. He barked once, circling an area near the bank. Jack knelt, brushing away snow with his glove. Beneath it, half buried, lay a crumpled pack of cigarettes and a lighter. The brand was cheap, the kind sold at Murphy's tap room where Tommy Barrett spent most nights. Jack slipped the evidence into a bag, his stomach tightening. It was Barrett. It had to be. But what gnawed at him was the scarf back in the cabin, the duct tape, the mattress. Those weren't the habits of a man who just lost control one night. This was something planned, something repeated. Apollo whined again, nose pressed to the ice, tail stiff. Jack followed his gaze across the creek to where faint tire ruts cut through the snow. A vehicle had been parked there, close enough to load something, or someone, before leaving. Jack rose, clenching his jaw. "He's moving," he muttered, "but not fast enough." Back at the sheriff's office, the evidence was laid out on a long wooden table. Sheriff Rhodes stood at the head, arms crossed, while deputies hovered nearby. The scarf, the duct tape, the cigarette pack, the guitar pick keychain with Barrett's name. "It's enough to bring him in," one deputy said. Helen shook her head. "It's enough to question him, but to make it stick, we'll need more. A jury's not going to convict on cigarette butts and old rope." Jack slammed a hand against the table. "He kept her there, Helen. You saw that cabin. That wasn't the first time he's done it. Rachel said he told her she wasn't the first. We don't have time to wait for him to slip up again." Helen's eyes softened, but her voice stayed firm. "We'll get him, but we do it by the book. No shortcuts." Apollo barked once, sharp and insistent, as if agreeing with Jack's urgency. That evening, Jack drove past Murphy's tap room, headlights cutting through the neon glow of the sign. A couple of trucks sat in the lot, exhaust curling into the cold air. Jack parked across the street, Apollo's head resting on the window frame, ears perked. Through the glass, Jack spotted Barrett hunched at the bar, nursing a beer. His wiry frame was tense, shoulders tight, like a man coiled for a fight. Jack's hand twitched toward the radio, ready to call it in. But something stopped him. Apollo's nose pressed harder against the window, his body stiffening. He barked once, then twice, not at Barrett, but at the far corner of the lot. Jack followed his gaze. A second truck, old rust red, with mud caked on the tires, not Barrett's. Jack narrowed his eyes. Could Barrett have a partner? He filed the thought away as he pulled back onto the road. Apollo's instincts had saved lives before. Jack wasn't about to ignore them now. The next day, Rachel tried again. Wrapped in blankets, her face pale but determined, she spoke haltingly to Jack in the hospital room. "I remember the smell of oil, and..." She closed her eyes, frowning. The sound of boots on wood. Not just one pair, two. At least two men. Jack's heart sank. Barrett wasn't working alone. Rachel's hand trembled as she clutched Apollo's fur. I heard one call the other by a name. I think it was Earl. Or maybe Carl. It was hard to hear. Apollo pressed closer, his steady presence grounding her. Jack nodded firmly. You did good, Rachel. You gave us more than enough. Later that night, Jack and Apollo returned to the cabin. Deputies had already taped it off, but Jack wanted another look. Apollo nosed through the snow around the back, tail stiff, body alert. He stopped suddenly, barking at the ground near a pile of brush. Jack hurried over, sweeping aside branches. Beneath them lay a battered duffel bag. Inside, women's clothing, a tattered notebook, and a silver bracelet engraved with initials, LM. Jack's blood ran cold. Rachel's initials weren't LM. This meant someone else. Another girl. Apollo whined, nudging the bracelet with his nose. Jack's throat tightened. God help us, he whispered. How many more are there? By dawn, the evidence was spread out in Helen's office. She rubbed her temples, her face pale. If Barrett has an accomplice, this goes deeper than we thought. Jack stared at the bracelet, anger simmering. Rachel said she wasn't the first. She was right. Apollo lay at his feet, but his eyes never closed, his ears twitching at every sound. He knew the hunt wasn't finished. That afternoon, Jack received a call from Ethan Miller, the 12-year-old boy who had filmed Rachel's rescue on his phone. His voice shook with excitement. Officer Callahan, I think I saw something. Jack frowned. What is it, son? Last week, before the storm, I was out by the creek near the cabins. I saw Barrett's truck. But there was another guy, too. Tall, with a beard. He was loading something into the bed of the truck. A big box. I didn't think much of it. But now, Jack's grip tightened on the phone. Another man. Another box. Thanks, Ethan, he said. You did good. Don't tell anyone else, understand? Yes, sir, the boy whispered. That night, as snow began falling again, Jack sat in the dark of his living room. Apollo stretched out at his feet. The house was quiet, but his mind was not. A partner, another victim, a trail that was already growing cold. He leaned down, running a hand over Apollo's fur. The shepherd's eyes opened, steady and fierce. Jack exhaled. Looks like we've got more hunting to do, buddy. Apollo thumped his tail once, as if to say he'd been ready all along. The next morning, they were back at the creek. Apollo pulled hard toward a stand of pines, nose to the ground. Jack followed, heart pounding, until the dog barked sharply, pawing at the snow. There, half buried in ice, was a rusted padlock, broken clean through. Beside it, another scrap of rope, and stamped faintly in the frozen mud was the tread of boots. 2 sets, side by side. Jack straightened, the cold wind biting his face. He looked at Apollo, who was staring into the woods with unwavering focus. 2 of them, Jack muttered. We're not just chasing Barrett anymore. Apollo barked once, sharp and sure, the sound echoing through the trees. The trail was still there, and this time they were going to follow it to the very end. The snow had eased, leaving Aspen Creek washed in a gray winter light. For most townsfolk, the storm's passing meant a chance to shovel driveways and get back to routine. But for Officer Jack Callahan and his K-9 partner Apollo, the break in weather meant something else. Another chance to chase the man who had left Rachel Morgan tied to a tree. And now, with the discovery of the bracelet and the suspicion of a second suspect, Jack knew they were running out of time. Apollo sat in the passenger seat of the cruiser, nose pressed against the window, ears pricked. He hadn't stopped fidgeting since they left the sheriff's office. Jack tapped the steering wheel as he drove through Main Street, scanning the rows of old brick storefronts. Aspen Creek looked like any quiet Colorado town. Church steeple, diner, grocery store, a bar or two. But Jack knew better. Evil didn't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes it parked its truck right under the streetlights. Where do you want to start, partner? Jack muttered. Apollo's head swiveled sharply at the words, his gaze locking onto the far end of Main, where Murphy's tap room sat hunched like a tired old man. Jack pulled over. Figures, he said, clipping the leash to Apollo's collar. Murphy's was the kind of bar where the wood paneling smelled of beer older than the bartender, and where arguments spilled outside as often as they ended at the pool table. Tonight, the place was quiet, only a handful of men leaning over their drinks. Apollo didn't pay them any mind. The shepherd's nose went straight to the back wall of the building, where bricks had darkened with years of grime. He barked once, pawing at the mortar. Jack frowned. "What is it, boy?" Apollo barked again, louder this time, his claws scraping until flakes of mortar crumbled loose. Jack pulled out his flashlight and leaned close. Something was wedged between the bricks, a small rusted tin box. He pried it out carefully, heart hammering. Inside were items wrapped in old cloth, a cracked cell phone, a silver necklace tangled in hair, and several torn photographs of young women. Jack swallowed hard. The faces were different, but all young, all scared. One of the photographs had Rachel's necklace visible in the corner, the same piece she'd identified as missing. Apollo whined, pressing his nose to the box as if urging Jack to see more. Beneath the photos lay a folded sheet of paper, brittle with age. Written in jagged handwriting were 4 names. Rachel's was the last. Jack's blood ran cold. Sheriff Helen Rhodes arrived within 20 minutes, her squad car pulling up beside the cruiser. She strode into the alley, her boots crunching the frozen gravel. "Oh, what have you got?" she asked. Jack handed her the box. She flipped through the photos, her face paling with each one. "Lord have mercy." Apollo sat nearby, his eyes never leaving the wall. Jack rested a hand on his head. "He's keeping trophies, and it's not just Rachel. We're talking multiple victims." Helen exhaled slowly, fighting to keep her voice steady. "This just went from bad to hellish." The following morning, the sheriff's office buzzed like a hive. Deputies came and went, radio chatter filled the air, and every square inch of the evidence board was plastered with photographs, maps, and names. The box from Murphy's sat in the middle of the table, now sealed in a bag. Jack pointed to the photographs. These weren't taken by chance. He wanted to remember them, which means this wasn't a one-off crime. He's been hunting girls for a while. A deputy spoke up. "We checked the names on that paper. 2 of them match missing persons reports from Denver and Colorado Springs. Both cases went cold last year." Helen cursed under her breath. "So Barrett isn't just some drunk with a temper. He's part of something bigger. Maybe he's not even the one in charge." Apollo barked suddenly, startling the deputies. Jack bent down. The shepherd's nose was pressed to the bag holding the box. He barked again, sharper, as if demanding their attention. Jack frowned. "He's trying to tell us something." "What is it, boy?" Apollo pawed the bag, then turned, staring at the evidence board. He barked once more, his gaze fixed on the name scribbled at the bottom of the list. Rachel Morgan. Helen raised an eyebrow. "He knows she was the last." Jack shook his head slowly. "No, he's warning us. Whoever wrote that list, Rachel wasn't supposed to be the last. She was supposed to be the next." The room went silent. That evening, Jack drove out to Rachel's house. Her parents had lived in Aspen Creek for decades, their home a modest ranch style on the edge of town. Apollo padded beside him as he knocked on the door. Rachel's mother answered, her eyes weary but grateful. "Officer Callahan, come in, please." Rachel sat on the couch, wrapped in blankets, her face pale but her eyes stronger than before. She reached out immediately, fingers tangling in Apollo's fur. The dog settled at her feet, a steady presence. "Rachel," Jack said gently, "I need you to think back. Anything you heard at the cabin, names, sounds, anything." She closed her eyes, breathing slowly. "I remember the sound of country music, old Johnny Cash songs, and the man. The one I think was Barrett. He kept talking about someone else. He called him Red." Jack's heart jolted. Red, a partner. Maybe the real mastermind. Apollo pressed closer to Rachel, his tail brushing her hand. She smiled faintly. "He makes me feel safe," she whispered. "Safer than anyone else right now." Jack nodded. "He's good at that, and he's going to help us find this man." 2 days later, a call came in from a contractor working near the outskirts of town. He'd found something strange while digging near an abandoned lot, the remnants of a shallow grave. Deputies rushed to the scene, Jack and Apollo among them. The shepherd bounded across the frozen ground, nose pressed to the soil. Within minutes, he barked furiously, pawing at a patch of disturbed earth. Shovels cut through the frozen dirt, revealing a box similar to the one from Murphy's. Inside were more belongings, another phone, a bracelet, and a torn sweater. Jack's chest tightened, another victim. Apollo growled low, his body tense. Jack crouched beside him, whispering, "I know, boy, I know." By the time dusk fell, Aspen Creek was a town on edge. Word had spread. There wasn't just one girl. There were others. Parents locked their doors tighter, kept their kids closer, and whispers about Tommy Barrett turned into certainty. He wasn't just a drunk. He was something far worse. Back at the office, Jack pinned the new items to the evidence board. The web of victims grew larger, the lines darker. "We're not chasing a ghost," he told Helen. "We're chasing a predator, and he's not working alone." Apollo sat at his side, eyes burning with focus. Jack leaned down, scratching behind his ears. "You ready to finish this, partner?" The shepherd barked once, sharp and sure. That night, sleep refused to come. Jack sat in his living room, a glass of untouched whiskey sweating on the table. Apollo lay on the rug, head on his paws but eyes wide open. Jack stared at the photographs pinned to the board he'd set up at home. Faces of girls who had disappeared, belongings recovered from boxes, the names scribbled in that jagged hand. He thought about Rachel's words. He said, "I wasn't the first." Jack clenched his fists. Barrett was a monster, yes, but Red? Red was the shadow behind it all, and Apollo had already proven he wouldn't stop until the trail ended. Jack whispered into the quiet room, "We're going to find him, buddy, no matter how deep he's hiding." Apollo lifted his head, his steady gaze locking with Jack's. The shepherd's tail thumped once against the rug, the sound echoing like a vow. The storm might have passed, but the hunt was only just beginning. The courthouse in Aspen Creek hadn't seen this kind of crowd in years. Usually it was small-town disputes, land boundaries, unpaid tickets, the occasional bar fight. But on this cold January morning, the benches were packed shoulder to shoulder. Reporters from Denver crowded in with their cameras. Locals pressed forward with whispers, and families clutched each other's hands. At the center of it all sat the accused, Tommy Barrett. Barrett looked smaller in person than the monster people had imagined. He wore a wrinkled flannel shirt, his hair greasy, his jaw covered in stubble. But his eyes, bloodshot, sharp, full of defiance, made the air thick with unease. Officer Jack Callahan stood near the front, Apollo sitting tall at his side. The German shepherd's gaze never left Barrett. Apollo's ears flicked back, his body tense, like he could smell the man's guilt in the air. Judge Henry Wallace, a stout man in his 60s with thinning white hair, tapped his gavel once. "Court is now in session. State of Colorado versus Thomas Barrett. Charges of kidnapping, unlawful restraint, and aggravated assault." The murmurs died down. District Attorney Karen Holt rose first. She was sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled into a bun and a voice that carried authority. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, pacing slowly before the jury, "this is not a case of a man who made a mistake. This is a case of cruelty, calculation, and control. On the night of the storm, Officer Callahan and his K-9 partner Apollo discovered Rachel Morgan tied to a tree in the freezing cold. She would not be alive today if not for their intervention." She paused, letting the words sink in. "And we will show you evidence that Thomas Barrett was responsible, not just for Rachel, but that he may be connected to other disappearances. Photographs, belongings, a list of names." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Barrett's lawyer, Richard Cole, stood quickly. Thin, balding, with a smirk that seemed permanently etched on his face, he raised a hand. "Objection. Speculation. The prosecution is already reaching beyond the scope of the charges." Judge Wallace raised an eyebrow. "Sustained for now. Stick to the charges before us, Ms. Holt." Karen nodded but smiled faintly. "Of course, Your Honor, but the truth has a way of surfacing." Apollo barked once, sharp and sudden, drawing every eye. Jack laid a steadying hand on his partner's back, but deep down he agreed. The truth was scratching at the door. Rachel Morgan was the first witness. She sat trembling in the stand, her parents close by for support. Her voice wavered, but she forced the words out. "He tied me there. I never saw his face clearly, but I heard him. He smelled like gasoline. He hummed Johnny Cash. And he said I wasn't the first." Gasps again. The judge's gavel struck. "Order in the court." Barrett shifted in his seat, his lips curling into a sneer. When the defense cross-examined, Richard Cole leaned forward with mock sympathy. "Ms. Morgan, you were traumatized, weren't you? Cold, terrified. Isn't it possible your memory is confused?" Rachel stiffened. "I know what I heard." And Apollo, lying at Jack's feet, gave a low growl that vibrated through the silent courtroom. Jack himself was called next. He recounted the storm, Apollo's barking, the discovery at the oak tree. He spoke of the cabin, the scarf, the duct tape, the cigarette pack. and finally the tin box hidden behind Murphy's wall. The photographs weren't just random, Jack said firmly. They were trophies, and Rachel's necklace was among them. That's not a coincidence. Richard Cole smirked. But Officer Callahan, did you see my client tie Rachel to that tree? Did you witness him at the cabin? Jack's storm gray eyes hardened. No, but my partner did what dogs do best. He followed the trail, and every trail leads straight to Barrett. Apollo lifted his head proudly, tail flicking once, as if punctuating the point. The evidence was damning, but the defense fought hard. Cole painted Barrett as a scapegoat, a troubled man with enemies. Sure, he drinks too much. Sure, he's gotten into fights. But there's no proof he tied that girl to a tree. For all we know, she's blaming the wrong man. The gallery murmured in disapproval. Even Judge Wallace frowned. But then the prosecution dropped something new. Karen Holt stood again, holding up a small evidence bag. Inside was the bracelet Jack and Apollo had discovered near the cabin, the one engraved with LM. This, Karen said, was not Rachel Morgan's. It belonged to another girl, Lindsay Matthews, reported missing from Colorado Springs last year. Case unsolved. Gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously. Rachel's mother sobbed quietly. And in Mr. Barrett's cabin, Karen continued, her voice hard, we found this bracelet. The same cabin where Rachel was kept. The same cabin where his cigarettes were found. And yet the defense wants us to believe he's innocent? Barrett's face drained of color. For the first time, he shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting to the jury. Apollo barked sharply, the sound echoing through the chamber like judgment itself. By late afternoon, the courtroom felt like a powder keg. Barrett sat stiff, his lawyer whispering furiously in his ear. Rachel was escorted out, pale but stronger than before. Jack remained in the front row, Apollo resting at his feet, though the dog's eyes never left Barrett. When the judge finally adjourned for the day, the gallery spilled out into the cold, chattering like birds. Reporters swarmed, microphones raised, asking Jack for comments. He said nothing, only resting a hand on Apollo's head as they pushed through the crowd. Outside, snowflakes began to fall again, soft and steady. Jack paused on the courthouse steps, staring at the white sky. He's hiding something, he muttered. There's more than what we found. Apollo whined, his nose twitching toward the west, toward the dark line of trees beyond town, as if he already knew where the next clue waited. That evening, Jack sat at his kitchen table, the bracelet glinting under the lamp. Lindsay Matthews, another girl, another victim. The thought gnawed at him. If Barrett had trophies, if there was a list of names, then Rachel was right. She wasn't the first, and she might not have been the last. Apollo lay across the rug, but his ears were up, eyes open, waiting. Jack rubbed his temples. What do you think, buddy? Barrett's guilty, no doubt, but he's not alone. Someone else is pulling strings. The shepherd thumped his tail once, then pushed his nose toward the door. Jack smiled faintly. Yeah, I know. You're ready to keep going. The next morning before court resumed, Jack walked Apollo through the frost-covered streets. Locals stopped to thank him, some reaching down to pet Apollo, who accepted their touch with quiet dignity. But Jack knew gratitude wasn't enough. Justice had to be complete. Back inside, as testimony resumed, Karen Holt leaned in close to Jack. We've got enough to put Barrett away for years, but my gut says you're right. He didn't act alone. The question is, can we prove it before someone else gets hurt? Jack's jaw tightened. With Apollo leading us, we'll prove it, one way or another. And as Barrett was led back into the courtroom, his sneer returning, Apollo let out another sharp bark, one that seemed to echo not just in the courthouse walls, but in the hearts of everyone watching. Because they all knew, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Snow blanketed Aspen Creek again, the kind that muffled the world into silence. For most of the town, it was just another winter evening. But for Officer Jack Callahan, silence was never comforting anymore. It felt like the pause before something terrible broke loose. He sat at his kitchen table, Apollo sprawled across the rug, his chest rising and falling steadily. On the table sat the bracelet engraved with LM, Lindsay Matthews. Jack turned it over in his hand again and again, as if the metal might reveal more than it already had. Barrett was behind bars awaiting trial. The courtroom drama had shaken Aspen Creek, but the questions lingered. Rachel's whispers, the photographs, the list of names, and now this bracelet. Everything screamed that Barrett wasn't the only one. Jack leaned back, rubbing his eyes. You can smell it too, can't you, buddy? This thing isn't finished. Apollo lifted his head, ears twitching. He gave a low whine and then thumped his tail once against the rug. A quiet agreement. The call came just after midnight. Jack's radio crackled to life. Unit 12, we've got a structure fire at Maple Haven Nursing Home. Multiple residents inside. All available units respond. Jack shot to his feet. Apollo was already up, alert, ready. Within minutes, they were tearing down the icy streets, the cruiser's sirens cutting through the still night. Maple Haven was one of Aspen Creek's oldest buildings, a wide brick nursing home on the edge of town. Smoke curled into the night sky, backlit by flames licking from the east wing windows. Elderly residents huddled outside, some in wheelchairs, blankets thrown over their frail shoulders. Nurses shouted, firefighters scrambled, chaos everywhere. Jack pulled up, Apollo barking furiously from the back seat. All right, partner, Jack said, unclipping the harness. Let's do what we came here for. The shepherd bolted out, nose twitching, tail stiff. He barked sharply, running toward the main entrance. Jack followed, heart hammering. The air stung with acrid smoke, flames snapping at the wooden beams above. Inside, visibility was low, alarms blaring. Residents still trapped screamed faintly down the hall. Apollo pushed forward, ignoring the chaos, his instincts locked in. He stopped at a door and barked hard. Jack kicked it open. An elderly woman sat slumped in her wheelchair, coughing violently. Apollo rushed to her side, barking until Jack reached her. Together, they pushed her out, coughing as smoke poured thicker into the hall. Got another one, Jack shouted to the firefighters rushing past. Apollo was already moving again. The dog darted through smoke-filled corridors, nose pressed to the ground. Jack trusted him completely, letting the shepherd choose the path. Apollo stopped again, barking at a locked room near the far end. Jack rammed his shoulder against the door, splintering the frame. Inside was a man, thin, gray-haired, curled on the floor, frozen with fear. Apollo pressed against him, nudging until the man stirred. Jack dragged him up, half carrying him out as Apollo barked ahead, guiding them through the haze. By the time they reached the exit, Jack's lungs burned, his throat raw. Firefighters took the man from him, shouting thanks. But Apollo wasn't finished. He barked again, spinning toward the east wing where the flames burned hottest. Jack hesitated. The roof looked ready to collapse. But Apollo was relentless, pulling at the leash, eyes locked on the smoke-choked hall. Damn it, Jack muttered, tightening his grip. All right, we do it together. They plunged back inside. The air was thick, heat pressing down, the crack of timbers splitting, echoing overhead. Apollo darted to a small room at the far corner. Inside was Evelyn Hart, a pianist in her 80s, her hands shaking as she struggled with her wheelchair brakes. Apollo barked, tugging at the blanket on her lap until Jack rushed in. He grabbed the handles, pushing hard as the wheels caught on the warped floor. The fire roared louder, the ceiling groaning. Hang on, Jack shouted. Apollo ran ahead, barking furiously until firefighters spotted them. Together, they hauled Evelyn outside just as the roof caved in behind them, flames exploding upward. Cheers erupted from the crowd outside. Residents wept, nurses clutched each other, and firefighters shook their heads in relief. But Jack barely heard it. He was bent over, coughing hard, his chest heaving. Apollo sat beside him, panting, soot clinging to his fur, but his eyes burned bright, unshaken. You saved them, Jack whispered, resting a hand on his partner's back. You saved them all. The fire was finally contained by dawn. The east wing was destroyed, but miraculously no lives were lost. Reporters descended quickly, cameras flashing, already spinning the story. Hero dog saves nursing home residents. Jack gave no interviews. He stood in the shadows. Apollo pressed against his leg, watching as exhausted residents were loaded into ambulances. But then something strange caught his eye. One of the firefighters carried out a half-burned box, recovered from the rubble of the East Wing utility room. Inside was paperwork charred at the edges, but tucked beneath it was a small leather-bound notebook. The firefighter handed it off, shaking his head. No idea why this was in there. Jack opened it carefully. His pulse spiked. Inside were scribbled notes, dates, initials, and short phrases. One line made his blood run cold. He took the others, but I kept him. Apollo sniffed the notebook, whining sharply. Jack's stomach twisted. The handwriting didn't match Barrett's scrawl from the list. This was someone else, someone who'd been keeping track. Back at the sheriff's office, Jack and Helen pored over the notebook. Many entries were cryptic, just letters and numbers, but a few were clearer. Alem, taken, creek, RM, Tadoke, E. Hold. Helen slammed the book shut. This proves it. Barrett had help, maybe even someone worse. Jack nodded grimly. And he's still out there. Apollo sat close, eyes sharp, tail stiff. He barked once, low and commanding, as though demanding they follow the trail now. Jack rubbed the dog's ears. Don't worry, partner. We're not letting him get away. That night, Jack sat in his cruiser, parked outside the burned shell of Maple Haven. The snow glowed pale under the moonlight, the air bitter and sharp. Apollo lay in the passenger seat, head lifted, gaze fixed on the ruins. Jack held the notebook in his hands, the words echoing in his head. He took the others. But I kept him. The phrase gnawed at him. Did it mean Barrett had taken some girls while the accomplice kept another? Did it mean Rachel had been chosen to be saved? The possibilities made his chest tighten. Apollo gave a low growl, nose twitching. Jack followed his gaze. At the far edge of the property, near the tree line, footprints stamped into the fresh snow led away from the building. Not firefighter boots, smaller, older. Son of a... Jack muttered, grabbing the flashlight. Apollo leapt out, nose to the ground, following the trail immediately. The prints wound into the woods, faint but steady. Jack's heart pounded as he jogged behind, the beam cutting through the trees. Finally, the prints ended near a stump, where something dark was half buried in snow. Apollo barked sharply, pawing until Jack cleared it away. A jacket, old, stained, with dried blood along the sleeve. Jack bagged it carefully, staring into the darkness of the woods. Apollo stood rigid, barking once more, the sound echoing into the night. The message was clear. Barrett wasn't the end. Someone else was out here, watching, waiting. By the time they returned to town, dawn was breaking again, painting the sky in pale blue. Jack leaned against the cruiser, Apollo at his side, both of them bone-tired but unwilling to stop. This isn't over, Jack said quietly. Not even close. Apollo pressed his head against Jack's leg, eyes steady, his body radiating the same relentless determination. Together, they stared toward the mountains beyond Aspen Creek, where secrets still hid under layers of snow. And deep down, Jack knew Apollo was right. The real hunt had only just begun. The jacket lay on the table in the sheriff's office, sealed in an evidence bag. Its fabric was torn, stiff with dried blood, the smell of smoke still clinging to it. Officer Jack Callahan stood over it, storm-gray eyes narrowed. Apollo pressed close to his leg. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the overhead light, but Jack's mind was racing. The notebook found in Maple Haven had been bad enough. Cryptic notes, initials, and that chilling line. He took the others, but I kept him. Now this jacket confirmed what he and Apollo had feared. Barrett hadn't acted alone. There was another man out there, someone who knew the woods as well as they did. Sheriff Helen Rhodes leaned against the desk, her silver hair pulled back in a tight braid. She looked older tonight, her face lined with fatigue. We've already got Barrett locked up, but this, she gestured to the jacket, this means we're still chasing shadows. Jack shook his head. Not shadows, tracks, and Apollo's going to find them. The shepherd's ears twitched at his name. He gave a sharp bark as if to say he was ready. The next day, Jack and Apollo followed the trail into the mountains beyond Aspen Creek. Snow clung to the pines, their branches bending under the weight. The air was sharp, every breath frosting in front of them. Deputies trailed behind, but Jack trusted only one partner in this moment, Apollo. The dog moved with purpose, nose low to the ground, tail stiff. Every so often he stopped, sniffed, then pressed forward again. They wound through the trees, across frozen creeks, past hunting cabins long abandoned. Finally, Apollo halted near the entrance to an old mine shaft. The opening gaped black against the white snow, wooden beams splintered with age. A rusted sign leaned against a rock. Aspen Creek Mining Co., closed 1972. Apollo growled low, his body rigid. Jack felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. This is it, isn't it, boy? Apollo barked once, sharp and certain. Flashlights cut through the darkness as they stepped inside. The air was damp and cold, echoing with the drip of water from unseen cracks. The mine stretched deep, rails still embedded in the ground, carts rusted in place. The deputies whispered behind Jack, but he raised a hand for silence. Apollo pulled him toward a door built into the rock, its padlock broken, the hinges bent. Jack's stomach knotted as he pushed it open. Inside was a small chamber carved into the stone, and in that chamber were remnants that made every deputy freeze. Women's belongings scattered across the floor. Scarves, shoes, notebooks. Photographs pinned to the walls. Faces of girls who had vanished. Some were torn, others marked with red X's. And in the corner a crude wooden chair, ropes frayed on its arms. Jack's chest tightened. Rachel had been lucky. Others hadn't. Apollo barked furiously, circling the chair, his nose pressed to the floor. He scratched at the dirt until Jack crouched beside him. Buried just beneath the surface was another notebook. Jack flipped it open, his throat tight. More names, more dates. And at the bottom, one phrase that stopped him cold. RM, saved. The dog ruined it. The realization hit like a blow. They weren't just dealing with Barrett. The accomplice had been watching that night at the oak tree. He'd seen Apollo cut the plan short. He'd seen them save Rachel. And he was still out there. Jack rose slowly, meeting Helen's eyes. This isn't over. Barrett was the distraction. The real monster. The one Rachel called Red. He's still free. Apollo barked again, his tail stiff, his gaze locked on the tunnel beyond the chamber. Jack swung his flashlight, but the passage stretched into darkness. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Jack clipped the leash to Apollo's harness. Let's finish this. The trail led deeper into the mine. Every footstep echoed, every drip of water magnified. Apollo pressed forward, unwavering. Then suddenly he stopped, ears pricked, body tense. Jack froze. Ahead, faint footprints in the dust, fresh. Someone had been here within hours. A sound drifted from deeper in the tunnel. The scrape of boots. A low chuckle. Thought you could take him away from me, a voice rasped, bouncing off the stone. But I kept the others. And I'll keep you too. The deputies raised their weapons, but Jack focused on Apollo. The shepherd growled, every muscle coiled like a spring. Red, Jack whispered. The man stepped into the edge of the flashlight beam. Tall, broad-shouldered, beard streaked with gray. His eyes glowed with something feral. He held a hunting knife, the blade glinting in the beam. You ruined it at the tree, Red snarled, but you won't ruin this. He lunged. The mine exploded with noise. Shouts, the crack of gunfire, the bark of a K9 tearing through stone. Apollo launched forward, slamming into Red's arm. The knife clattered across the floor. Jack rushed in, pinning the man as deputies swarmed. Apollo stood over Red, teeth bared, a low growl vibrating in his chest. For the first time, Jack saw fear flicker in Red's eyes. The deputies hauled him up, cuffs biting his wrists. His voice echoed in the chamber, wild and bitter. You think you saved them? You've only saved one. The others were mine long before you came. Jack stepped forward, his voice steel. Not anymore. You're finished. Apollo barked sharply, sealing the words. By dawn, Red was locked in a cell beside Barrett. The two men glared at each other, silent but seething. The deputies muttered that it was like watching snakes in a glass box. But Jack only felt relief. The nightmare was over. Rachel and the others could rest, knowing justice had come. A week later, Aspen Creek gathered in the town square. Snow still covered the ground, but the air carried a warmth of gratitude. Families held signs. Thank you, Apollo. Children ran forward to hug the shepherd, who stood patiently, tail wagging. Rachel was there too, a scarf wrapped around her neck, her smile fragile but real. She knelt to stroke Apollo's fur, tears brimming in her eyes. You saved me, she whispered. You saved all of us. Jack stood back, watching. For years, he'd carried grief in silence like armor. But now, seeing Apollo surrounded by love, he felt something shift inside. Hope. That night, back at home, Jack sat by the fireplace. Apollo lay beside him, head resting on his knee. Outside, snow drifted softly against the windows, but inside, the world was calm. You did it, buddy, Jack murmured. You found the truth when no one else could. Apollo wagged his tail once, his eyes closing in contentment. This story has been a journey through darkness and fire, through fear and resilience. And yet, at its heart, it's about loyalty, the kind that never wavers, the kind that pulls people back from the edge. Apollo wasn't just a K-9 officer. He was a protector, a healer, and a light in the storm. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. Now I want to ask you, if you were standing in Jack's shoes with Apollo by your side, would you have the courage to follow the trail into the dark?